severe negative aggregate demand shock. Now, when we look around the world and examine what central banks do or how they behave, we actually see that there are two different groups that they could fall into, depending upon how we want to think about their goals. And these are called a hierarchical mandate or a dual mandate. It actually turns out the vast majority of central banks have a hierarchical mandate. That is, you must meet goal number one before you consider pursuing goal number two. And goal number one is price stability. So all of those central banks, those 2 or 3 dozen that I mentioned earlier, that have explicit inflation targets, all have hierarchical mandates. Now, there are a few central banks, the most predominant of those being the Federal Reserve, that actually has a dual mandate. Its legislative mandate is to maintain price stability and maximum sustainable employment. Do both. Equally weighted. Now, there has been a movement in Congress recently to change that, but it has not really made any progress. The movement to change that is to get rid of the maximum sustainable employment. And let's just focus on price stability or inflation targeting. So we want to look at what the implications are if we think only about inflation targeting. Now, in order to do that, we need to introduce one more brand new concept, something called the equilibrium real interest rate. And the equilibrium real interest rate is really, really easy. It's the real interest rate that exists when the economy is in general equilibrium. The real interest rate that exists when the economy is in general equilibrium. Okay? So here we are at a spot where the economy is in general equilibrium at point A. Notice the economy is at potential output. We have an inflation rate of pi naught. So if we looked at our monetary policy curve, pi naught, come up to our monetary policy curve to point A, we find this is our equilibrium. This is our actual real interest rate, R naught. But because this is also general equilibrium, it's also our equilibrium real interest rate. Okay. Now, we're going to be coming back to this equilibrium real interest rate in just a minute. What we want to look at now is what are the implications for the economic performance if a central bank is doing inflation targeting? What are the implications for economic output and therefore unemployment, when a central bank is targeting the inflation rate? Now, remember, we've already seen there are 3 different kinds of shocks that can happen in an economy. Shocks to the aggregate demand curve, shocks to the long-run aggregate supply curve, or shocks to the short-run aggregate supply curve. So we want to see what that means in terms of doing inflation targeting. So we're going to look at each of these different kinds of shocks, and we're going to look at them under 2 different scenarios. The shock is going to happen. The first scenario that we're going to examine is, what if the central bank does nothing? Absolutely nothing. What happens? We know eventually the economy goes back to general equilibrium, but we'd like to know what else is happening to inflation and interest rates. And then as the second scenario, we want to have exactly the same shock, but we want to compare scenario 1's outcome with scenario 2, where the central bank is targeting inflation. So we're going to have 3 different kinds of shocks, 2 different scenarios for each shock. So we've got a lot of graphs to go through. So we're going to start in general equilibrium, have a negative aggregate demand shock, no policy response. Right? We're just going to let it play out. And of course, this is fairly straightforward. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. That's our negative aggregate demand shock. Now, this aggregate demand shock is not monetary policy induced. So this is actually a shock from the IS curve, not the MP curve. So when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, economic output falls to Y1, and inflation falls to pi 1. So that's just a simple, straightforward negative aggregate demand shock. Now, with that lower inflation rate at pi 1, we would also see that the real interest rate would fall to R1. Now, we are not in general equilibrium at this point, so R1 is not the equilibrium real interest rate. So if we come back to our aggregate demand and supply model, we also know what is going to happen in the long run. We know that there will now be a series of adjustments of expected inflation that's going to cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift down. Depending upon how flexible or sticky prices are, this could take a relatively short period of time or a relatively long period of time. But we also know where long-run equilibrium will be, right, at point N. So eventually, the short-run aggregate supply curve falls to SRASN. We're at point N, where the economy now is back to general equilibrium, and the inflation rate has fallen to pi N. And once we get there, no further changes until there's another shock. Now notice that inflation fell to pi N. So one of the things that we see then is in our new general equilibrium, we have a lower actual unemployment rate, R sub n, but we're in general equilibrium, so that also means that the equilibrium real interest rate has declined. But there's been no monetary policy change. These are all simply movements along the MP curve. Okay? So that's scenario number 1 under a negative aggregate demand shock. Now, scenario number 2. Going to start again in general equilibrium. We're still going to have a negative aggregate demand shock, but now we want the central bank to stabilize inflation. So the first part of this looks exactly the same. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. I'm going to call this AD1A because something else is going to happen. Economic output falls to Y1A, and inflation falls to pi 1A. This is exactly the same as what we saw in scenario number 1. And that lower inflation also means that the real interest rate will have declined to R1A. But remember, in this case, we're saying that what happens if the central bank stabilizes inflation? Right? So inflation has fallen. What is the central bank going to do to get us back to our inflation target? Right? We want to be up here, not up high 1A. So in this case, the central bank needs to have an expansionary monetary policy, which will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift back to its original location. And by doing so, we return to general equilibrium at potential output and at our target inflation rate. In essence, if the central bank can act quickly enough after the shock and with the right order of magnitude, any deviations from potential output or the inflation target would be relatively short-lived and very transitory. So this would be one way of keeping inflation very close to the inflation target. Now, the second thing to notice is in order to do this, the central bank needed to have an expansionary monetary policy. It does that by reducing R bar, the autonomous component, which causes the monetary policy curve to shift down. We got back to our original inflation target. Notice that in general equilibrium, the real interest rate fell to R1, but this is general equilibrium, so this is also our equilibrium real interest rate. That is, the equilibrium real interest rate fell in both cases, and it fell by exactly the same amount. In essence, the real interest rate changed regardless of whether the central bank intervened or not. The difference between these two scenarios is how long it takes for the economy to get back to general equilibrium after that initial negative aggregate demand shock. When the central bank responds, it gets back very quickly. If they don't respond, depends on how flexible wages and prices are. Now remember, if they don't respond and it takes a number of years, the unemployment rate is above the natural rate, so we've got a lot of unemployment that's going on during the self-correcting mechanism process. Now there's one other way to see that monetary policy basically has no effect on the real interest rate, equilibrium real interest rate. And that is, let's consider what's happening with the IS curve. So here we start with being in general equilibrium. The IS curve's on the at the level of, or the real interest rate is on the IS curve at potential output. So we can see here that we started with a negative aggregate demand shock that originated with the IS curve. So the IS curve then would have shifted to the left. Notice that tells us then that the equilibrium real interest rate will be lower. So if you really want to know what's happening to the equilibrium real interest rate, you don't need to know what's happening on the monetary policy curve. Just figure out what's happening with the IS curve. Now notice that when the central bank responds in terms of targeting inflation, in essence it's also targeting output at potential output or targeting the unemployment rate at the natural rate of unemployment. Achieving the inflation target also achieves the natural rate of unemployment in potential output targets. So there's no conflict or trade-off between the two. This is something that is referred to as the divine coincidence. Right? You get to achieve both of your objectives by following a single policy, or a policy aimed at only one of your goals. And as we just said, monetary policy has no effect on the equilibrium real interest rate. The reason for that is, of course, equilibrium real interest rates are determined by saving and investment decisions. Saving and investment decisions, not by monetary policy. Remember, we started in general equilibrium, we ended general equilibrium, so we're really talking about a long-term analysis again. The central bank policy can change the real interest rate in the short run, but not in the long run. Okay, so that's aggregate demand shocks. Let's think about long-run aggregate supply shocks. Again, we're going to start in general equilibrium at our target inflation rate. Now we're going to have a permanent negative aggregate supply shock, no policy response. So if there's no policy response, the negative shock will cause the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. And we'll also see at the same time that the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift up. Look familiar so far? Widespread computer breakdown? Okay. By the way, that shouldn't have been a big surprise. It was on your first exam, too. Right? Same question was on your first exam. I'll give you a hint. It won't be on the third exam. Okay, so this is what happens for that negative shock. Economic output falls to Y1. Inflation rises to pi 1. Now, because of that higher inflation at pi 1, the monetary policy curve tells us what happens to the actual real interest rate. It goes up. Now, of course, where we are is a short-run equilibrium, but not a general equilibrium. So once again, there'll be a self-correcting adjustment mechanism taking place. The inflation expectations will change. They have to move up. And we know exactly where we end up, right? Where the aggregate demand curve intersects the relevant long-run aggregate supply curve. So when the adjustment process is complete, we'll be at point N. Economic output will have fallen to Yn, which is our new lower potential output level, and inflation will be up at pi n. So we've got much higher inflation, and we've got the economy at potential output. And at higher inflation, with no policy response by the central bank, simply tells us that we move up along our monetary policy curve to that higher real interest rate, which, now that we're back in general equilibrium, is also our higher equilibrium real interest rate. So that long-run shock with no policy response shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve to the left and the short-run aggregate supply curve up. We get adjustments to expected inflation, so the short-run aggregate supply curve continues to shift up until we get back to general equilibrium at a much higher inflation rate. That higher inflation rate also means we have a higher real interest rate and also a higher equilibrium real interest rate. So that's scenario 1. Let's go back and think about scenario 2. General equilibrium, target inflation rate to begin with, our negative permanent shock. Now we want to target inflation. So the first part is going to be exactly the same. Call this Y1A before the central bank responds, and pi 1A. So far, economic output falls, inflation rises, just like it did in scenario number 1. That higher inflation rate also means that the real interest rate has gone up in the short run. Okay. Whoops, these should all be A's, 1A's. Okay. But remember now, the central bank is going to target inflation at its, target inflation at its T level. So in order to do so, we need to bring inflation back down. The way that we would do that would be with a contractionary monetary policy, which would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. We need to end up right here on the relevant short-run aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve. Inflation is now at pi 1, our target level, and economic output is now fallen all the way down to Y1, which is our new lower potential output level. What's the unemployment rate here? The natural rate of unemployment. What was it here? The natural rate of unemployment. So the labor market is now adjusted in a way that we're still at the natural rate of unemployment. So what we needed, though, was to have a contractionary monetary policy. The monetary policy curve had to shift up. Inflation came back down to its target level, but the real interest rate rose. And now that we're back in general equilibrium, it also means that the equilibrium real interest rate increased. Once again, what we see is the equilibrium real interest rate rises by exactly the same amount, regardless of whether the central bank is targeting inflation or not. It does not matter. In the long run, the central bank cannot influence the equilibrium real interest rate. It's determined by saving and investment decisions. Notice also, by targeting inflation, we're keeping the unemployment rate at the natural rate of unemployment. So once again, there's no trade-off or conflict between the goals. If the central bank is targeting inflation, whether it's an aggregate demand shock or it's a long-run aggregate supply shock, targeting inflation also keeps the unemployment rate at the natural rate of unemployment. It just gets you to that equilibrium or general equilibrium solution faster than doing nothing. Once again, we can see this outcome by looking at the IS curve. So what we saw earlier was we started in general equilibrium. So we had our equilibrium real interest rate. We then had a negative aggregate demand shock, which shifted the IS curve to the left, causing the equilibrium real interest rate to fall. Again, regardless of whether the central bank responds or not. In this case, we have a situation where potential output has declined. So with that decline in potential output, we can see that the equilibrium real interest rate will rise, again, regardless of what the central bank does. No conflict, the divine coincidence holds. So central banks, who are inflation-targeting central banks, don't have anything to worry about when the shocks to the economy are either aggregate demand shocks or long-run aggregate supply shocks. By targeting inflation, they are also achieving a zero output gap or zero unemployment gap. Well, let's see if the same thing is true when we have a short-run aggregate supply shock. Again, we'll start scenario 1, general equilibrium at our target inflation rate, a temporary negative aggregate supply shock. Again, scenario number 1, no policy response. So in this case, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up. Economic output falls.